I'm Tracy with Legacy Woodworking Academy, and today we're going to build a jewelry box using the Ornamental mill. Let's go ahead and get started. In this first class, we're going to make the components for the sides, the lid, and the base. You'll need 4 pieces that are about 20 inches long by 2 inches wide, 3/4 of an inch thick. 2 of these pieces will become the rim or the lip of the lid. The other 2 pieces will become the base. Then you'll need a blank that is 7 3/4 by 4 3/4 by 3/4 of an inch, which will become the top piece. You'll need 2 of them, about 8 inches by 3 1/2 for the sides, and also 2 of them that are 11 inches, and that'll become the front and the back. We're using bloodwood and some wormy maple. And of course, I've gone to the table saw and ripped the stock and cut it to length. And then you could either use a joiner to make sure one side is perfectly flat and then a thickness planer to dimension the stock. Or you can simply go to the ornamental mill, like I did, and machine off one surface. Now at this point, we want to make sure the surface is perfectly smooth so the double-sided tape will stick when it comes time to mill this. So I'm going to use the sand flea. This is like a joiner, only it uses a drum sander to sand that off perfectly smooth. Okay, so you can see that's very simple to do. It's going to give us a beautiful finish. And I'll also want to clean up these edges to remove any saw marks here. Okay, now this part is ready to go. And then I've marked this surface with an X. This is the side that I will machine off. This is the surface side that will go onto the table. It's perfectly smooth. And again, this is the side we'll use the template to create the profiles for the molding. The first part that we're going to work on is the base. And we've cut up our stock 2 inches wide. We've dimensioned it to 3/4 of an inch thick and cut it 20 1/2 inches long. And we have 4 pieces. These 2 will be for the base. These 2 will be for the lid. We used a piece of 3/4 inch MDF to make a table to put on the bed of the mill. For this project, the table needs to be at least 42 inches long. To mark the center of the table right here, we position the router at 0 on the y-axis, and then we install the V-groove bit. And we plunge that bit down till it touches the table and scribe a line, and then key back with a pencil and darken that in. So this line is at 0 on the y-axis. Next, I cut a board wide enough that when I set it here against the back rail, the edge is at 0 on the table. I put 2 pieces of double-sided tape on this board, and then we'll position this against the back rail and stick that down. And this will act as our fence. We'll also put some double-sided tape on this part and then just attach it up against that fence. You want to put a little pressure on this to make sure that that tape sticks well. Referring to the drawing, we're going to take bit number 808 and we're going to position it from the back edge over 2 3/8 of an inch, and we're going to plunge it down until it's 1/8 of an inch off the surface of the table. So we have bit number 808, and we're going to plunge that down until it touches the surface of the table. We need to raise the router 1/8 of an inch at this point. I'm going to use a set of feeler gauges, and I set 100 thousandths plus 20 plus 15. That's 125 thousandths or 1/8 of an inch. And we'll lock the plunge bar at that position, and then raising the router, we'll simply place that between the plunge bar and the stop and lower it down until we have that spacing. At this point, we'll go ahead and reset the plunge bar. So when we plunge the router down, it's going to be 1/8 of an inch off the table surface. Now we'll position the router at 2 3/8 of an inch on the near side. And then we'll set this stop on the back side. We're now ready to make this first cut, but I don't want to do it all in one pass. So I'm going to move the router off to the side a little bit, and then we'll make a cut and then bring it over a little bit at a time until we get to the final depth. This part is complete, so we'll use a chisel to lift that off. And we'll then stick our next part down and repeat the same process. Next, we're going to make the molding for the lid. And you can see the cross section here. The plans will show you step by step. We start by cutting off the corner. And then we'll use this router bit to round off the edge, and then the core box bit to form that profile, and that'll complete that part. The first step is to cut out this corner, and this could be done on a router table, it could be done on the ornamental mill, or you could use a table saw to cut that out, your choice. Once we've got that corner cut out, we'll apply some double-sided tape, and I've attached this first piece with the corner up on the top here. We're going to round off this edge here using bit number 1276. To set the plunge depth, we'll lower the bit down to the shoulder of the cutter, just touches the surface of the wood. Then we'll lock the plunge bar at this depth. To set the y-axis, we'll bring the router bit over until the edge of the cutter touches the edge of the wood. Then we'll lock this stop in place on the back side of the split nut. Again, I won't make this all in one pass. I'll bring it out a little bit, make a cut, and then slowly bring it over until we get to the stop. Again, we'll take this part off now. And using the double-sided tape, we're going to do the same thing to the second part. For the last step, we're going to use bit number 808. For this cut, we've positioned the router at 1 5/8 of an inch in from the back edge. And then we set our plunge depth for 3/8 of an inch off the table. Once again, we won't try and make it all in one pass. We'll plunge down a little bit, make a cut, and then continue plunging down until we get to the final depth. these first components that we made on the machine are just straight linear pieces of molding. And so you can position the router bit and just cut along the length. For the next pieces, we're going to use templates and form a profile a little bit differently. So let's take a close-up look at the drawings real quickly. The first piece we're going to make is the side of the box. And it's going to create this Bombay shape. We don't have router bits that are going to form those profiles, so we're going to use a single router bit and a template. For this part, there is a template that comes with the plans if you purchase the measured drawings. And what I'll do is simply cut along this line on the bottom, like so. And then we'll take a piece of 3/4 inch MDF, and we'll attach this template to this piece. Let me show you how we're going to do that. There are actually 3 different templates that will be used in this project. 2 of them are for the lid. We're going to focus right now on the template for the sides of the box. All of them will use the same size blank. We took a piece of 3/4 inch thick MDF and cut it 3/4 of an inch wide. Now we'll take this piece and using a little spray adhesive, we'll spray one edge right here. And you can pick this up at your local office supply. And then we'll simply stick the template right onto the blank. And we would do that for all 3 templates while we're at it. We'll then take and cut this out either on a bandsaw, or we can simply sand to the profile, and we'll create the 3 different templates. I've cut this to length, and I'm not even going to bother to cut this out on my bandsaw. We'll just go ahead and sand this right to the line. You can see that'll only take a few seconds. For these inside curves, then we'll go to this other type of sander. So you can see how we can very quickly sand these pieces to right up to the template. We'll use this first template to make these components for the sides of the box. We're using bloodwood for the sides of the box. We cut 2 pieces 8 inches long by 3.5 inches wide, and 2 pieces 11 inches long by 3.5 inches wide. We then cut 1/4 of an inch out on the corner of each part. Let me show you how we're going to set up the template and the parts in order to machine these components. First of all, I've got the fence on the back, just a piece of 3/4 inch MDF, and that front edge is at 0 on the y-axis. And we've used a little double-sided tape to stick down these 4 pieces, or these blanks. You want to put a little pressure down on these parts to help bond the tape. Now we have a line that comes right off this center line right here. And I've put a piece of double-sided tape back here a couple inches away from the end of the part. And I'm going to take this template with the small side towards the center line and stick that down. Again, put a little pressure on here to make sure that bonds well. Now we'll position the router bit here to set the depth, and then we'll machine along the length. And then we'll come back, move it in the y-axis, reset the depth, and make our next cut. Now keep in mind, you always want to make sure that you have proper dust control, especially when using exotic hardwoods like this. We'll use a dust mask, and we'll hook up the shop dust collector right here to the back of the machine, and I've also set up with the vinyl screens to kind of control the sawdust. I will also be wearing a dust mask and obviously some eye protection. The dust mask that we'll use is called the Dust Be Gone. It does an excellent job at filtering out the finer particulates, and it's washable and reusable. Now we'll start at this end, and we'll position the router at 3/8 of an inch on the y-axis. And then we'll position a stop on the back side of the y-axis screw. For this step, we'll use bit number 808. Now I've rotated the router bit so that it is perpendicular to the template, and then we'll plunge the bit down until it just touches the surface of the template. Now I'll set the plunge bar for the final plunge depth at the starting point. Now we'll make this first cut in several light passes, so I'm going to raise the router bit a little bit, lock it in place, and then we'll cut down along the length and then readjust the plunge depth until we get to the final depth. Now I'm going to turn on the dust control and make the first cut. The next step is to bring the router back to the template, and we're going to use the y-axis handle to drive it over 1/8 of an inch, or a half a turn. Then we'll rotate the router bit till it's perpendicular to the template, plunge it down till it just touches the surface, lock it in place, and we're ready to make our next cut. You can see we can very quickly follow a template to create an odd-shaped molding like this. Of course, it would be faster to use router bit profiles that created the entire design in just a couple of passes, but this is always an option for you. Next, we're going to mill the top of the lid, and this will require two templates, one for the profile from this edge and one for the profile from this edge. So what we've done is, based on that center line, we have drawn a line off to the side so that when we stick the blank down, it's going to be centered on that line. Now, we scrabbed the line off this edge, and that creates the edge for this template, which we have mounted at this point. We also scrabbed the line off this edge, and we will now apply this template for the end, again, based on that edge. This time, we're going to start here at the center of the template and machine along the length of the part, and then we'll move over and work down one side, and then we'll start here at the center and work down the other side. Now that we have this profile finished, we're going to start at this end, actually at the top here, and work down this edge, and then we'll start at this end, at this mark, and work down this section. The middle section here is flat, so we won't have to machine this. We'll open the split nut on the y-axis so the router can slide back and forth in this direction, and then we'll lock the carriage down on the x-axis, and that way we'll make an adjustment with the x-axis screw for each cut. Now that we've cut off this edge, I'll open the split nut and move it down to cut off the opposite edge. We're now ready to sand the parts, and again I'm going to use a dust mask, and I'm also going to use a downdraft table to control the dust. Now I would suggest you start with 100 grit and then work your way up to 220 grit to finish the parts. I'll use my palm sander when I'm doing the coarser grits, but when it comes down to the final grit, I'll do this by hand. So here are the two pieces for the lid. These are the two pieces for the base. This is the top of the lid. And then, of course, here are the sides, the front and back of your box. In the next lesson, we're going to show you how to assemble this and finish it. In this class, we're going to finish the jewelry box. We'll miter all the pieces and glue them together and then finish it. Before we cut the miters, we're going to machine the pockets for these hinges. I'm going to use the optional vertical vise to make the relief cuts for the hinges. To start off with, I'll measure the length of this piece and mark the center. And then from the center, I'm going to come over 4 inches on each side and make a mark. So here's the center line, and I've made a mark at 4 inches off to the right side. I'll simply lay the hinge in here in place and mark this edge. And we'll make the cut right here. We've done the same thing on this side, marking out the position of both hinges. Now it's critical that this is set level, so I'm going to use a piece of 3/4 inch MDF and just put it here on top of the vise and ensure that this is flat. If one side is higher than the other, of course you would cut deeper on one side than the other. So we'll adjust this and then tighten it down on the vertical vise. Now the reason that we do this before we cut the miters on these corners is so that we can clamp it in the vertical vise while these ends are still square. We'll need to calculate the proper plunge depth for this relief cut. So we'll take the hinge and close it, and then we'll measure the thickness of this section here. And it is measuring 0.172 inches. If you take 0.172 and divide that by 2, you'll get 0.086 or 86 thousandths of an inch. So we'll slide the router over and plunge the router bit down until it just touches the surface of the wood. To make this cut, I want to go just slightly less than 86 thousandths. If I go too deep, then the lid won't close. So it's better to leave just a little bit of a gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to round this down to 80 thousandths. And I'll use a set of feeler gauges. This first one is 40 thousandths. We'll add 30 and then another 10. So those combined will be 80 thousandths of an inch. So we'll place the 80 thousandth spacer between the plunge bar and the stop, and then lock the plunge bar in place. As we machine through here, we can get a little tear out on this edge. So one trick is to use some masking tape and just line it up with the edge of the cut, like so. You can also take a razor blade and score the wood right at the front of the cut on that mark. Now we'll plunge this down to the final plunge depth, and then we'll cut right through the center. Now the hinge should fit in there just snug, like so. In the next step, we'll take these parts and miter the ends. I used a table saw to miter the ends of these parts. And now I need to make a mark for the biscuit joint. I'm going to measure from this edge right here up 1 inch. So I set the blade of my T-square, or my sliding square here, to 1 inch, and I'll make a mark at that point. And of course I'll do that on each piece on both ends. Set the biscuit joiner at 45 degrees, and we'll simply line up the center line here with the mark that we made on the part. And cut that slot. Before I made this cut, I used just a piece of waste to do a test cut so I could get the proper depth set on my biscuit joiner. And then we cut this slot for a double F biscuit. That's going to fit together nicely. We're ready to glue this together. This is the base piece. And of course we've cut the 45-degree miters, and we're going to flip it upside down and line this up. And then we're going to make a mark 1 inch from the inside corner. And we've marked all 4 corners. Now we're ready to cut the biscuit joint. Now we've set the biscuit joiner back to 90 degrees and adjusted the plunge depth. And then we'll line this up with the mark here on the part. And make that first cut. Of course, we'll do it on both ends and on all 4 parts. Once we've cut all the pieces, we adjust the plunge depth and make a second slot. This will make the joint much stronger. And now this part is ready to glue together. This is the molding for the lid. On this piece, we measured from the inside corner here 3/4 of an inch to make the mark, and then set the plunge depth so this had an 1/8 of an inch thick wall at this point. And now this part is ready to glue up. And we'll actually do a dry fit to make sure everything's going to fit together correctly before we glue it all up. Gluing up the frame for the base and the lid is pretty straightforward and simple. I want to show you a trick that we're going to use to glue up the box to make sure that it's perfectly square. Now, I don't like to fight with all 4 corners at the same time when I'm trying to glue this together, so I glue up 2 at a time. Go ahead and remove these clamps, and you can see I use some rubber bands to hold the piece together as the glue is drying. So I glued up these 2 corners. Now I used the 3D squares to hold these pieces together. And that way, when I clamp these up, I know that this inside corner is going to be perfectly square. And then, of course, I go back to the rubber bands to hold it all together. So now we'll simply glue these 2 corners, put it together. I'll turn the squares this way, so they'll hold these corners square as we let the glue dry. You'll find these 3D squares extremely useful when it comes time to glue together projects like cabinets in boxes. Of course, it's cut out square, and then these 2 sides are folded up, and then they are machined so that they're perfect square in both directions. So when we put this inside the box, we can simply clamp that to the square, and that's going to hold it as the glue dries. You can get more information on the 3D squares on our website at legacywoodworking.com. Let's go ahead and glue this piece together. Obviously, we've got the biscuits in here that we'll need to glue into the slots and then apply glue to the corners to clamp it together. I like to use a sheet of wax paper to put down under the project so I won't get any glue on my bench. And we'll go ahead and glue the biscuits into place first. Now just make sure there's plenty of glue on the surface here to get a good joint. Now it's a good idea to keep a damp rag around so that you can clean up any glue. All right, at this point we'll go ahead and put the box together like so, and then we'll put the 3D squares inside, and I'll take some rubber bands. I've put about 5 or 6 of them together to act as a clamp around the box. And then we'll come back and clean up any excess glue on the joint here. Those corners look nice and tight. We'll go ahead and, as this glue is drying, we'll continue on with another part of the project. With these pieces all glued together, we want to make sure that the surfaces are perfectly flat. So I'm going to go back to the sand flea now that they're glued up. I'm using a 180 grit sandpaper, and that'll give me a beautiful finish. Make sure that the parts are perfectly flat. We'll do the same thing with the lid. Now we can use the palm sander to round off the outside edges. Unfortunately, this inside curve here really can only be done by hand. Once these 3 components are glued together, we can make the other parts. The first one was a piece of 1/4 inch maple. We thickness planed it to 1/4 inch and then cut it so it'll just fit in the bottom of the box. And of course, we'll attach that. When we go to put the lid on this section right here, we don't want to glue that onto it, so we're going to use a different technique. We've got a block of wood that we've cut to fit right inside of this piece, and then we'll run some screws down through this to attach the lid on the top side. You'll want to make this part a little bit thinner, probably about 50 thousandths of an inch, than the rim here. So there'll be a gap between that board and this component. The reason we cut these parts last was so that after it was all glued up, we could measure the opening and cut the part to fit perfectly. We made a relief cut here and here for the hinge. Now we need to make a relief cut in the bottom of the lid to match. Let me show you how to lay that out. Start by measuring the inside of the box. Then you measure the inside of this opening in the lid. You minus the opening of the lid from the opening of the box, take that dimension, divide it by 2, and that will tell you the distance from this edge down to the back of the hinge. I prefer to use dial calipers as opposed to a measuring tape to take these dimensions. It's far more accurate. We'll measure the inside of the box, and we're measuring 6.18. Then we'll measure the opening in the lid, and we're measuring 4.04. The difference between 6.18 and 4.04 is 2.14. If you divide that by 2, you'll come up with 1.07. So we'll set the dial calipers for 1.07 and mark from this inside edge right here a line. And you can see I've marked both sides for the hinges. Now I measured and marked the center of the lid in this direction, and I marked the center of the box here. So if I simply line those center marks up, I can then mark the placement of these hinges. So we'll machine a relief cut here and here, and of course the hinge will be placed just like that. You have two options for holding this part in place when you mill these pockets. You could use the flat table and double-sided tape like we did on the molding, or you can use the optional horizontal vices as shown here. If you use the vices, you'll want a piece of waste block here so that you don't run the router bit into the clamps. I plunged the bit down until it touched the surface and then set the plunge depth for 80/1000ths of an inch. We're going to use bit number 1276, which is actually the roundover bit, but it has a 1/4 inch flat in the center of the cutter. I've set a stop in my y-axis so that the edge of the bit will come up against that line. And now we'll go ahead and make this cut. The next step is to finish the parts. Now for these maple parts, the base and the lid, we're going to use an artisan dye. This is a alcohol-based aniline dye. I get it from Craft Supply. And we're just going to dye it black, and then we'll put a finish over the top of that. Whenever you're working with dyes, it's a good idea to use gloves to protect your skin. Now we've sanded the parts all the way up to 320 grit. And then, of course, clean them off. And we'll use a foam brush to apply the dye. Just pour a little dye right directly onto the brush. And then go ahead and put this on, a light coat. You don't want to do this too heavy of a coat. It's better to do multiple light coats. All right, now once we've got that covered completely, we'll simply let that dry. I'm going to move this out of the way for a second and show you the next step. Once it's dried, we'll use a very fine steel wool and just lightly, very lightly brush this off, and that'll smooth off the surface. and get it ready for the next coat. Once the second coat is completely dried, we'll use the fine steel wool to finish that off, get it nice and smooth. And then you'll want to take a clean cloth, a tack cloth, and get all of the sawdust and everything else off there. Now what we're going to use to finish it is a tung oil. This is a Waterlux Original. This is one of my favorite finishes. And this we'll apply with a rag. You can see how that tung oil is just going to make this finish really pop. And you can see the grain of the wood through the dye. Now we'll let this coat dry, and then we'll put on a second and a third coat, and then once all the parts are completely finished, then of course we'll assemble the box. For the box, which is made out of bloodwood, and the lid, we're going to use the tung oil. And of course we started by sanding this all the way up to 320 grit, and then wiped it clean with a tack cloth, and then we'll apply the finish. We'll let this coat dry completely, and then we'll add a second and a third coat, and as many as we want until we get the finish that we like. Well, we've finished all the components. Now let's take a look at the hardware that you're going to need to assemble the box. You're going to need 4 number 6 by 3/4 inch flathead screws, and these need to be steel so you don't break them off in the wood. You'll need 4 number 8 by 3/4 inch brass. Those are flatheads as well. And then you'll need 2 number 10 by 1.25 inch, and these I chose a round head. You could use a flathead if you wish. All right, we'll start by putting the bottom of the box in. Now, if you take a look at this, you can see I've drilled 4 holes to mount this into the box, and then 4 holes to mount it into the base. Because we're using flathead screws here, you'll need to countersink these holes. 4 of them on one side and 4 of them on the opposite side. You'll also want to pre-drill these holes as well. And I've cut this bottom so it's got a little bit of play. We're not going to glue it into place because this is a solid piece of wood. If this was plywood, we could glue it in and it wouldn't be a problem. Because it's a solid piece, we're going to just run 4 screws into the corners. And these have to be steel because they're the number 6 screws. You don't want them to break off inside that hardwood. Now we'll take the box and center it on the base, and of course I've already pre-drilled these holes as well. And these will be the flathead brass screws that go in here. Now before we assemble the lid, we've attached the hinges. Now, just one note on the hinges. The 4 screws that mount into here, I had to sand shorter so that they wouldn't protrude through the back of the top of the lid. I've already drilled the holes in these parts to assemble this. You'll take this blank and insert it into the lid like so, and then put this behind it, and we'll line up those screws. And tighten this up. I chose to use a round head. If you want a flathead screw here, of course, you'll need to countersink these holes as well. And the last step, of course, is to attach the lid to the box. And that completes the box.